Picture this, the dead of night, August 8, 1963. A Royal Mail train is speeding through the English countryside, carrying millions of pounds in used banknotes. It's just another routine journey, or so it seems. But on this night, history is about to be made in one of the most audacious heists the world has ever seen. This is the story of the Great Train Robbery. Our story begins not on the tracks, but in the mind of a man named Bruce Reynolds. Reynolds was an ambitious, charismatic career criminal with a taste for the high life. He wasn't interested in small-time jobs. He wanted to pull off something legendary. He assembled a crew of over a dozen men, a who's who of London's underworld. Each a specialist in their own right. There was Gordon Goody, the muscle and organizer, Buster Edwards, a former boxer, and Ronnie Biggs, a small-time crook who would become the most famous of them all, though not for his role in the robbery itself. The target was the Glasgow to London mail train. This wasn't just any train, it was a mobile bank, transporting huge sums of cash from Scottish banks to be taken out of circulation in London. The gang knew that the day after a bank holiday weekend, the haul would be exceptionally large. Their inside information, likely from a postal worker, suggested there could be up to £3 million on board. That's over £60 million, or about $75 million in today's money. The plan was as simple as it was brilliant. They needed to stop the train in a remote location, away from prying eyes. They chose a spot called Sears Crossing in Buckinghamshire, a secluded stretch of track with a signal light they could manipulate. The gang's electronics expert, an acquaintance who knew how railway signals worked, showed them how to turn the green light to red. It was surprisingly low-tech. They just had to cover the green light with a glove and power the red light with a 6-volt battery. As the train, named the Special, approached Sears Crossing just after 3 a.m., the driver, Jack Mills, saw the red signal and dutifully brought the massive locomotive to a halt. His co-driver, David Whitby, got out to use the trackside telephone to find out what the holdup was. He quickly discovered the phone lines had been cut. That's when the gang, masked and clad in boiler suits, emerged from the darkness. They swarmed the engine cabin. A struggle ensued, and tragically, the driver Jack Mills was hit over the head with an iron bar, an act of violence that the gang leaders later claimed was never part of the plan. They uncoupled the front two carriages, the engine, and the high-value packages coach where the money was from the rest of the train. The plan was to drive these carriages about a mile down the track to a bridge where their getaway vehicles were waiting. But they hit a snag. None of the robbers knew how to drive this specific type of diesel-electric locomotive. They had brought along a retired train driver to help, but he couldn't make sense of the modern controls. In a moment of high-stakes irony, they had to force the injured and terrified driver, Jack Mills, to move the train to their designated spot, Bridego Bridge. Once at the bridge, the real work began. The gang formed a human chain, passing 120 mailbags filled with cash down the embankment to a fleet of Land Rovers and an old army truck waiting below. It was a frantic, physically exhausting 30 minutes of work. They hauled bag after bag, filled with a staggering £2.6 million. With the vehicles loaded, they vanished into the night, leaving the train crew tied up and the remaining 10 carriages of the train stranded. Their destination was a rented farmhouse about 27 miles away, Leather Slate Farm. This was supposed to be their sanctuary, a place to lie low for a few days while the police heat died down, count the money, and divide the spoils. They celebrated, played Monopoly with real cash, and listened to the news reports about their own incredible crime. They were on top of the world. They had pulled off the perfect heist. Or so they thought. The plan had been to stay at the farm for a week, but paranoia began to set in. The sheer scale of the police manhunt, which was immediately launched, was far bigger than they had anticipated. The public was captivated, but the authorities were furious. The gang decided to cut and run early, leaving the farm in a hurry just a few days after the robbery. And this is where their perfect plan unraveled. They hired a man to clean the farmhouse and burn everything, but he got spooked and fled without doing the job. When the police, acting on a tip from a local herdsman, finally discovered the hideout, they found a treasure trove of evidence. The The robbers, in their haste and arrogance, had left their fingerprints everywhere on the Monopoly board, on a ketchup bottle, on plates and glasses. This single, sloppy mistake would be their downfall. The police now had the crucial evidence they needed. One by one, the robbers were identified and hunted down. Charles Wilson was caught. Gordon Goody was arrested. Buster Edwards fled to Mexico but eventually gave himself up. Bruce Reynolds, the mastermind, managed to evade capture for 5 years, living in Mexico and Canada before finally being apprehended in England in 1968. Most of the gang were sentenced to a staggering 30 years in prison. But the story doesn't end there. 2 of the most famous members had their own dramatic postscripts. Charles Wilson escaped from prison after just 4 months, only to be recaptured 4 years later in Canada. And then there was Ronnie Biggs. In 1965, he escaped from Wandsworth Prison by scaling the wall with a rope ladder and jumping onto a waiting removal van. He fled to Paris, then Australia, and finally to Brazil, where he lived as a fugitive for over 30 years, taunting the British police and becoming a bizarre sort of folk hero. He eventually returned to the UK in 2001 due to failing health and was re-imprisoned. The Great Train Robbery remains one of the most famous crimes in British history. It was a story of meticulous planning and brazen execution, and done by simple human error. Of the £2.6 million stolen, only about £400,000 was ever recovered. The rest vanished, fueling decades of speculation and myth. It was a crime that captured the public imagination, a daring raid that turned a group of criminals into household names and cemented their place in legend. Thanks for watching this deep dive into one of history's most incredible heists. What do you think was their biggest mistake? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video.